Okay. Now, what about executive pay? How should we pay those people? Right? Executives, after all, run a company but do not actually own it, or at least not usually. Right? How can we align their incentives such that they do what's best for the company? So, what we have is sort of the owner who owns the company, and then there are executives. All right, this is just another facet or another illustration of the principal agent problem, right? Where the owner is the principal and the executives are the agent, right? And so what we want to do is align the incentives of the executives such that they behave in a way that benefits the owner, right? Or that not only benefits the owner, but does the same thing that the owner would want to do or would do if he or she were the executive themselves, right? If the owner were there doing it, what would the owner want done, right? We want to make it so the executive behaves in the same way as the owner. Now, one way we could do this would be to tie their pay to the profitability of the company. After all, the more money the company is making, the better these people must have been doing at leading the company, right? Well, so one problem with that is that they might try to use gimmicky accounting tricks to make it look like this year's profits were really high. Or they might pick projects that pay off in the short run while they're employed, but are costly in the long run, which comes after they've retired or found a new job, right? And so tying the executive's pay to the profitability, right? So maybe tie to profitability, right? Well, maybe, but this has problems, right? We can use budget tricks. We can select specific projects. There's all kinds of tricks that we could do, right? Or maybe we can give them, pay them in stocks. Right? So if we pay them in stocks or give them the option to purchase stocks at a discounted price, right? This, it would seem, would give them an incentive to maximize stock value, which is typically tied to the expected long-run performance of a firm. But this has sort of three drawbacks, right? So one, stock prices are influenced by more than just the efforts of the execs, right? They're also influenced by the overall bullishness of investors, meaning that executives might be rewarded for sheer luck instead of making good business decisions, right? The second problem is that stock prices vary pretty wildly, at least compared to everything else, right? So think back to 2008 or 2009, right? And so as a result of, if we were to pay executives in stocks and stock prices vary wildly, then we may have to offer some sort of compensating differential to make up for the riskiness of being paid in stocks. And the third challenge with being paid in stocks is that once an exec sells the stock, then their tie is over, right? They are no longer tied to the company. So really, the executives could, even just like they did with profitability, they could try to maximize the value of the stocks today, or at least in the time leading up to their retirement, right? And then sell them, at which point it could be revealed that these stocks weren't worth as much as people thought, right? Now, all that being said, right, the CEO pay has become increasingly tied to stock values, and there is strong evidence that despite these three problems, this payment method actually does work pretty well. However, there is also evidence that tying CEO pay to stock prices leads them to make safer investments over riskier ones, even if the riskier ones are technically the better choice, right? For example, suppose that you had two business options in front of you. One would increase the value of the company by a single dollar with absolute 100% certainty, while the other has a 10% chance of increasing the value of the company by $1 billion and a 90% chance of doing nothing to the company's value, right? In this admittedly absurd scenario, we'd probably want the CEO to pick the second option, even though it's riskier. But we can imagine a CEO picking the first one because it will definitely increase their pay. So if the CEO is significantly risk averse, if they don't like uncertainty, right, then we can imagine them picking the other one, even though, right, we can imagine them picking the safe one, even though the riskier one might be the better option for the business itself. Okay? So in conclusion, this week's lecture notes and the chapter that you're reading highlight the particular challenges that both employees and employers face. Now, I have admittedly presented problems that employers face in paying employees, but that's only because these are easier to illustrate and explain, right? The other side of this is just as valid, right? The important lesson from this week's notes is that while it's important to consider what amount and in what form you pay your employees, so how much you pay them and whether you're paying them in medical care or health insurance or cars or cell phones or whatever, it's also important to recognize that how you pay your employees based on hourly salary, based on output or anything like that, is at least just as important and perhaps even more important, right? And being in a position to create the rules, so to speak, does give you a lot of scope to do a lot of things, right? The challenge, however, lies in picking the right rules such that even the worst of people are induced to act as if they were good people. If we knew that workers and employers would always honor their promises at all times, none of this week's material would matter. But it is precisely because we do not and cannot know that they will do this at all times that we must craft these rules so carefully. And so it reminds me of a quote from James Madison in Federalist Papers number 51, right, where he says that if all men were angels, no government would be necessary, right? And similarly, if government were run by angels, no checks or balances or anything like that would be necessary either, right? And so given that men and women are not angels, right, we must have rules that prevent us from taking advantage of our opportunities. And so this week's notes are discussing the merits and costs of various structures of rules, right? Different ways to incentivize people to stick to their promises, okay? And so now, hopefully you have an understanding of this, and you can analyze the different ways that different employees are paid and sort of learn more about those businesses, right? You now know that in situations where you see people being paid based on commission, right? It must be difficult to observe their effort levels. And so, or it's easy to count things where the quality is roughly the same at all times, right? You might as well pay by commission. So Christmas tree farmers, for example, which is coming up now, right? They're typically paid based on the number of trees they sell, right? Well, why does that work? Because the trees are all roughly the same quality once you go to the tree farm, okay? And so you can analyze all kinds of things now based on the form in which the employee and the employer are paid, right? Which is kind of cool and empowering. So hopefully you can go forth and apply this to the rest of your life.